Thanks for tuning in to The World We Want, the NAAEE podcast, a project of the North American Association for Environmental Education. If these episodes resonate with you, after the podcast, check out our website, which contains opportunities for professional development, resources for educators and administrators, and guidance on how you can incorporate environmental education into a broader teaching strategy. Visit us at NAAEE.org/podcast. And thanks for listening.
Welcome to The World We Want, the NAAEE podcast. Hi, I'm your host, Gerry Ellis. So what is the world you want? I'd like to see a world where we look at environmental education as something found in all aspects of learning, where it is more than a separate nature education experience, but instead woven into the fabric of our daily lives, where the lines between environmental education and good education disappear. That in turn means giving innovation and experience the space to nurture the future of environmental education for both teachers and for learners.
I think part of what we're trying to do as well is create, people that think outwardly, look for creative solutions, and we need lots of creative solutions.
And I've seen the magic of that in professional development experiences. Teachers say, this is going to change my teaching.
On this episode of The World We Want, we tap into over 4 decades of environmental education wisdom, experience from formal learning spaces to the natural classroom. Both of our guests have a lifetime dedicated to supporting environmental educators, creating the tools to improve teaching methods, and ensuring that the field is culturally relevant and inclusive. Kathy McGlauflin has served as National Director at Project Learning Tree and Senior Vice President of Education at the American Forest Foundation, where she created hands-on materials for teachers, developed professional training for educators, and pioneered urban environmental education curriculum. Dr. Gus Medina is an independent consultant specializing in environmental education both nationally and internationally. He led the U.S. EPA National Environmental Education Training Program and has served over a decade at World Wildlife Fund supporting conservation and environmental education across Latin America and the Caribbean. Both are past presidents and former board members of our very own NAAEE, and both have played integral roles in creating professional development programs and implementing these works in the real world with educators and administrators. Needless to say, their dedication to improving how we teach and learn about our relationship with the natural world gives them more than a few things to talk about today. On the World We Want podcast, we draw on the experience and insights of great thinkers, creators, educators, and conservationists, as well as some of the newest voices driving change around the world. And what do they share in common? Environmental education, one of our most powerful tools for creating a more just and sustainable world. It inspires, it enlightens, it influences attitudes, and most importantly, it drives us to become better guardians of this planet. And now I'm delighted to welcome to The World We Want, Kathy McGlauflin and Gus Medina. Kathy, Gus, welcome to The World We Want. I am so excited to have you both here. This podcast has covered environmental education and education in general from so many directions. We have been touching on all the changes that have taken place and are taking place right now. So I can't think of anyone who could offer us greater perspective and insight than the pair of you.
I think of it as like the clothing you wear. It is who you are. It's the smiles you wear.
Well, thank you.
Thank you. And I'm excited to be with Gus doing this. We have a wonderful history together.
Yeah, started out kissing, but Kathy and I were working on a conference together, and fundraising is always an issue. So at one of the plenary sessions, I don't know who came up with the idea that, we would offer kisses to the audience for 25 cents.
No, it was more than that.
I hope so, because that sounds awfully cheap now.
Yeah, I was going to say.
I think it was $1.
Good, because I hope that Kathy isn't that cheap. If she is, there will be a booth right after this podcast,
right.
which will. But that's how it started.
Yes.
Well,
I hope you knew each other a little bit before you started kissing.
Right. So they could either buy a kiss from Gus or buy a kiss from me, and we ran around and collected money and gave kisses.
It was fun. I don't know how much money we raised. I don't think I ever heard. But anyway, it was fun. I think the audience enjoyed it. And it's one of those things that just kind of lowers the pressure level and people have fun and enjoy it. So it was good that way.
The beauty of what you two can offer us in this conversation, I think, is you have a perspective on not just environmental education, but developing programs for environmental educators, seeing those programs grow, change, evolve over time. Because we're talking, probably 30, 40 years in both of your cases. And sometimes it can seem like nothing's changed, like we're fighting these fights new. So how have you seen it evolve over this time, both from people getting involved in it, but also from the programs that both of you have built? And I'd like to talk about those programs, how those programs have evolved and built and the impact that they've had and the challenges that they've had.
I think that what I've seen is, and Gus and I have chatted about this, this sort of movement from what was to what is. And we've often in our field talked about the nature study movement that took place around the turn of the century and how engaged people became with that and getting outdoors and the whole national parks movement, to conservation education and where a lot of the federal agencies got involved. We've seen the big movements grow together and change and evolve. And then today we hear about more interest in sort of a reimagining environmental education and how it can change the world with getting folks to better connect to nature. So it's kind of like it's coming back around in some respects.
I would even take it a little bit further back because of, if you look at settlement houses in urban areas in early 19th century, where social service people were looking at urban kids and they were already appreciating the need to take kids outdoors. And so that's one of the earliest roots. And then you've got the soil conservation movements, the water conservation movements that took place during the droughts in the West during the 30s, wasn't it? 1930s. And that whole sort of conservation mentality, which developed there and evolved into things like conservation education, outdoor education, which are all elements of the field and from which environmental education is an outgrowth. And then since then, there have been all these other kind of shoots that have been coming off: sustainable development, education for sustainable development, and
climate change education,
energy education. But I think fundamentally, many of these, I think the fundamental changes that I see, although I would say with conservation, with soil conservation, for example, there was always an action component to that because it was mostly working with farmers, trying to keep the soil on the fields, and there were certain things that they could do to actually reduce soil loss. So there's been an element of conservation there for a long time. The nature study movement for a long time was just kind of getting out and appreciating nature. And there wasn't really an action component to that. And I think even though environmental education really stressed, I think from the very beginning, that we needed to take action, it was very difficult to get to that place for a whole variety of reasons. But it was often the thing that got left off. Because
we started with the awareness. A lot of programs began and ended with getting kids outdoors to enjoy nature and learn about the environment, but didn't take that next step. I think that's where some of the programs that Gus and I worked on did attempt to take that next step: awareness to knowledge to action.
It's interesting, regardless of the age of the person we've talked to or the program they're involved in, that disconnect to nature keeps coming back. Looking at, sort of a long view of it, why is it we lost that connection and then now we have to find it back?
That's a good question. I mean, I'm just theorizing here, but I think, we have evolved as a society where we tend to be more and more disconnected from nature because of the creature comforts that we have now. We live in buildings. We live in cities that often don't have much vegetation in them. We spend a lot of time on screens, looking at nature, but not being in nature. So I think that disconnect has evolved over time. And if you go even further back, nature was often a scary thing in terms of having to deal with the environment, either, snakes or insects or, droughts and floods. So I think as humans, we always had that kind of a little bit of that love-hate relationship. Maybe indigenous Native Americans had a better perspective on that, where they seem to be able to, accept that reality and feel more like a part of it. But they were always very much on the land. They were connected to the land. So I think just the whole way we have started, or the way we lived has evolved, has made that disconnection. And unless you're a special person to make that effort to get out there, and whether it's birding or hiking in the woods or just taking a walk around the neighborhood, it's very easy to forget that's there. And there are lots of things that sort of look like, the therapy that nature gives you, but it's not really providing that therapy. It's masking it, I guess.
Yeah, there is, especially in the digital age, I think there's an illusion of connection that we embrace, but it may not be there. Just seeing the visuals, while they're impactful, you don't smell it, you don't hear it, you don't feel the change in the air or the humidity. Yeah, you don't. There's no sense of place to it. You don't watch a Netflix film about some animal and feel that place.
I think too, as an educator, working with teachers and students and what works in a classroom, and it isn't always just getting outside. A lot happens inside as well. And so I think some of the work that I've done and Gus has done and many of us have done have made those connections to the classroom. How can we get that educator to connect with his or her students to better understand the world around them, their place within it, and their responsibility for it? And sometimes that means not just going out in a green schoolyard, but it's also understanding how energy works. How do we create energy? How do we manage for energy? What do we do with resource management? How do we handle these things that aren't just nature? That environmental education is about all of it. It's not just nature. One of the things that I learned early on was that there's a lot of students out there. And if we think we can reach them by going in and doing an hour-long program in classroom, we'll never get there. And so that's why we have to go up a level and work with the teachers. So that I think there's value in having outside experts come in and do presentations. But if that's what you're limiting your program to, you're limiting it to that 1 hour that those kids see that person. And often the teacher does leave the room. It's not unusual. So we always felt that professional development had to be a part of this. It's not the only answer, but it's certainly an important part to reach the educators who are in turn reaching the students. I've had lots of discussions over the years about, well, we go direct to the kids and we give them our message. And I'm like, well, that's great. That's good for you. And there's a place for that, but it can't be either or. So I think we've seen the challenge is how do you then get the teachers to participate in that professional development experience? I'm working on a project with superintendents, for example, and we're trying to get how do we go top down so that superintendents make it good and easy and appropriate and the right thing for their faculty to engage in environmental education. How do we get them to say, this is something we want in our district, in our schools? As well, you have to go to the classroom teacher and say, this is, some great stuff that will help make your teaching better and your kids excited about learning. And so both ends. And then you get the teachers to come to professional development experiences. We also think at the teacher training level, someone mentioned that in a talk today about the importance of pre-service education, getting those people who are training to become teachers to have that embedded in their teaching. And that's a tough one to get to. We have progress. We have a lot of folks, for example, here at the conference who are doing that, but they're a piece of what's the teacher training programs across the country. So that's another way to get at them at the beginning. So it becomes part of who they are as a new teacher.
And I think I would just kind of echo what Kathy said, because that pre-service training is really essential. And a lot of teachers, the reality is that pre-service training is great, but you really don't learn to become a teacher until you're actually in the classroom. And you're faced with the reality of 20 to 30 kids, and you're responsible for those kids for 6 hours a day, 5 hours a day. Very few people could really handle that. It's a challenge. And, you've got 20 to 25, 30 different personalities in that room. And you have basically a set curriculum that you're supposed to follow. And these kids are supposed to know X, Y, and Z by the time they leave your classroom. And those curriculums are pretty jam full. Everybody's trying to get in on it. So teachers have to pick and choose. They have to be focused on, how do I get my children to learn these primary concepts? And if, your programs are sort of coming out from left field and not somehow connected with what that educator has to do in the classroom, achieve in the classroom, you're not going to make much progress.
We always said it had to help them do what they already are supposed to be doing. So it wasn't a separate subject area to be fit into a very crowded school week, that it was integrated and made a part of what they're already supposed to be doing. And the hope, of course, was that it was maybe perhaps a better way of teaching the kinds of things that they had to teach and a better way to engage their students.
And you need special skills. I mean, there's always an emphasis in taking kids outdoors, learners outdoors. But, you need a whole nother set of skills in terms of managing groups. It's very different managing a group of 25, 30 kids in a classroom versus being out in a forest. And how do you do that safely and efficiently and effectively? So, one, you don't lose any students. Two,
I've only done that once.
they actually are able to tie that back. Because again, we don't want these one-time experiences. If it doesn't fit into the curriculum, if it doesn't fit into what the teacher is going to be normally that he or she had to achieve, then it becomes a one-time of experience. If it really helps further the curriculum, then it gets reinforced in the classroom. And that's what you really want. And that takes a lot more time. Too many times programs are kind of developed independently of teachers, and they're just kind of drop-in programs. And again, they might be nice for one classroom session, but then it's gone. I think the more effective programs really work with teachers and superintendents and principals. What do you need? How can we make that happen? And it has to be a collaborative effort. Because if they don't have buy-in into that program from the very beginning, when funding cuts come, when you lose staff, when you lose that particular teacher who's really enthusiastic, the program disappears. So if you don't build that institutional foundation for these programs, the work is short-term, and you're basically constantly starting over. And that's a reality.
It feels like what you're both saying is we need to back up and back up and back up a little bit. Like we need to get, if we need to get these teachers in the very earliest stages learning how to incorporate this in, then we need to get the people who are teaching them to teach them how to incorporate this in. And then we have to back up again. And the people who are overseeing them and keeping their professorships or whatever going, they need to understand the value of this. So it's like we're backing up. I hear that little beep, beep, beep sound from machines that back up. It's like going and going and going and going. Yeah.
But I don't discount the value of going direct to an existing classroom teacher, perhaps one that's been in the classroom for 10 to 15 years, and providing them some tools that they weren't made aware of before. I mean, I've seen the magic of that in professional development experiences. Teachers say, this is going to change my teaching. You know, that they see the value in this other way of teaching and learning. So it doesn't. It works at the beginning, but it also works, midstream too.
Yeah. I think part of the issue too is how teachers are taught, how pre-service is done, and it's often a lecture approach. You have to learn X, Y, and Z, and you have to pass examinations, and then schools are making the same requirements on them of their students. So it's really tied up in an entire system of how we teach and what are we teaching for. And if we're not looking seriously at that in terms of, all right, what kinds of citizens does the future need? What kinds of skills do they need? What kind of sort of, intellectual curiosity, decision-making? Our society is changing. That's all part of it in terms of, we're not future thinking enough. We're still, schools are often several years behind in terms of what that student is going to have to be able to know and do when they get out of school.
That seems like something that environmental education could bring to, formal education, is that environmental educators seem to be much more in tune with listening to what the needs are of the kids they're working with, the groups they're working with. I mean, Jaime Gonzalez, he started this podcast off actually with the first podcast we did, and talking about engaging, BIPOC cultural groups, inner city, with nature, and really listening to who they were as people and culture and what they needed and how they connected to things culturally. And it seems like that's a really powerful lesson that environmental education could teach the formal education system, is listening. And it's something we've heard over and over and over through these podcasts, listening.
And not just formal education, but we also work in the non-formal settings or informal. It depends on which language you want to use. But really the same is true in that world. The folks who work at nature centers and zoos and aquaria and museums, and they're reaching formal. They're it's always confusing because they're non-formal educators reaching formal students, who are coming to their sites. It's a funny thing, and they have to make their programs connect with what has to happen back in the classroom too. So we need to work. We do work with those leaders as well, to make sure they are listening to their communities and what are the needs in their community, what do the schools in their community need and want for programs and projects and activities that their facilities offer.
Yeah, and I think the field has changed a lot in terms of, we had a lot of preconceived notions about what environmental education, well, not what environmental education is, but what is appreciation of the environment and being engaged with the environment. So, I grew up in New York City, and, taking kids out into nature, their idea was taking the kids up 30 miles up the river, the Hudson River, and spending some time out in a residential camp or visiting a park. But that was like a one-time experience. The rest of the year, they're in this urban area. And, when I did my doctoral dissertation, my theme was, what's the difference between environmental educators? How do environmental educators and urban children, how are their perspectives similar or different or the same? And I found out, I showed them pictures of natural areas and kind of intermediate areas and urban areas. The kids really liked the urban areas. the environmental educators really liked the natural wild areas. And then looked a little bit closer. Well, why is this? We know why the environmental educators like the urban areas, but the urban areas, kids could ride their bikes, they could play ball. There are all kinds of, areas where they could really play. So, and of course, that's what they were familiar with. They weren't familiar with this. That was another variable, is just level of familiarity with the environment. So kids were very familiar with the urban environment. Environmental educators were very familiar with rural, kind of wild environments. And they were talking, they were trying to bring that perspective to these urban children without really appreciating the place where urban children lived and what was valuable about the place where they lived and how they could actually engage in that community to appreciate the nature that was there, because nature's all around us, even in the most urban areas. But their idea was get them out of the city, get them out here, and somehow that was supposed to kind of change their lives. And it didn't. I mean, it was a wonderful experience, but the reality is 3 days I'm back in my urban environment, and I probably won't get back there, I don't know, for years, if not decades.
Hi, everyone. I'm Carrie Albright from NAAEE. That was our host, Gerry Ellis, speaking with Kathy McGlauflin and Gus Medina about the exciting growth and evolution of environmental education over the years. If the themes that Kathy and Gus are sharing resonate with you, find some great examples of practical materials and resources used by educators in the field and in the classroom by visiting NAAEE.org/podcast. That's NAAEE.org/podcast. We'd love for you to connect with us on social media at the NAAEE, or send your thoughts by email at podcast@NAAEE.org. And now back to our conversation with Gus and Kathy, sharing insights from a lifetime spent building out the future of environmental education.
It seems like so much of environmental education, it's like these punctuation marks.
Well, that's why I just really strongly believe in the idea that it's not a one-time thing, but that an educator, it's integrated across the curriculum, across the disciplines, that it happens every day. It doesn't happen on Friday afternoon. And we have to nurture that feeling. And that helps us, I think, to think bigger about environmental education, that it isn't just nature education. It's all of the above. I said this earlier, learning about the world around me, my place within it, and then my responsibility for it. So that's really critical to me, to have that connection with the students, that they see this as a part of their life. And, the perfect world, of course, would be that it starts in early childhood, and we have great early childhood programs going on across the world, all the way through college experiences and beyond to adult education. We also, environmental educators care about adult education. A lot of the work, for example, going on with climate change education is about helping communities understand how they can become resilient by learning about what can they do, what is it, how does it affect me, and what can I do about it. So it's, that's my perfect world.
The world you want?
It's the world I want.
One of the wonderful things I think that's happened in the field is we're moving away from the individual child to the family. So you're seeing a lot more kind of programs focus on families. So, I mean, if your parents are not, or whoever your guardians are not engaged with nature, don't feel comfortable in nature, chances are I'm not going to, you're not going to be comfortable with that. So, I mean, you can get that exposure in school and helps, but most of education happens outside of schooling, and especially during those early formative years, from basically 0 to, 4 or 5 before they start school. That's where the foundation begins. And if kids aren't getting outside at that age, if they're not having positive experiences outside, it's, they start at a deficit. in terms of being able to appreciate the environment and engage with it. So these early programs that work with very young children, they're key, I think, in terms of developing that foundation. I've always felt that preschool teachers and kindergarten teachers should actually get the most money salary-wise. And then it should go down from there as the kids get older instead of what it is now.
Oh, I don't know.
And then it should go down from there as the kids get older instead of what it is now.
Oh, I don't know. Have you been in a middle school class?
That, it's really interesting that this idea of starting at a deficit, I never thought about it quite that way. And does that change the way that we should think about programs we develop? And if you think about this in those terms, that a child is coming into, school, a setting, formal school setting, and is coming in at a deficit, the first thing you need to do is, how do we level the playing field? How do we give them information and engagement and experience that helps them level the playing field? And I know that sounds kind of more lofty, but sometimes it's just like, I've picked up a bug in my life, where this kid has never picked up a bug or had dirt in their hands. We used to do stupid things as kids. I mean, I remember my baby brother coming in and he's got slug slime. He ate a slug. He came in and there's like goose slime all over. And my mom's yelling at us like, why did you let him eat a slug? I don't know he ate a slug. But there's an experience there, right? Good or bad. But there's an experience. You learned about a mollusk, or about this invertebrate. And I wonder if that's something we're not thinking about.
Well, I think education does think about that. If you know about the Head Start program, for example, the movement for Head Start was critical to try to give all students coming into that first classroom an equal footing, because that Head Start program makes these students who otherwise don't have the same benefits that other students have, they get that early start, because the other kids have already gotten it. So, and I worked a lot with Head Start programs to integrate environmental education into those programs as well, getting them to see a slug, maybe not eat a slug, but to have them, to look at roly-polies and the things that are right in their classroom. So it's not like we don't know we need to do that. It's just, what's the scale of it and how do we make it scalable so that it's not just isolated pockets that are getting these wonderful, nurturing early experiences, but it's broader than. We have a lot of work to do.
A lot of these early programs spend a lot of time working with kids and actually handle, creatures are in the classroom. They get to handle creatures. They get to, get their hands dirty. And it's a supportive environment, and teachers are there, and other kids who might have positive experiences will show them how to hold a snake and things like that. So I think there are ways to overcome that. I don't think it takes a huge amount of effort to bring kids up to a level playing field. Except if they had some kind of traumatic experience in nature where they got bit by a snake, or, they got stung by a bee or something. That might require a bit more work. But most kids, I think, will jump into it.
They're open to it because they have that, as Rachel Carson said, a sense of wonder.
But I think, from an education standpoint, we claim to love children, but we don't really put the money behind that. Education is always generally underfunded. It's more of a mass education approach. And the minute you get into mass education, then you have to standardize things. You can't cater to individual needs. So are we really supporting education? And then, of course, I don't want to take it there, because it's just education can become a very political football.
I guess I keep reaching out and trying to figure out, where is that thing that flips the switch in which at least we know steps in the direction?
Well, I'd like to think that many of us are making those steps, but I think we do a lot of good. And I think one of the challenges that those of us who are in this feel when outsiders come in and say, oh, why aren't you doing X, Y, or Z? And it's like, I've been doing this. We're working at it. We're trying our best, And So I just think that a lot of good is happening, and maybe it's how that I've mentioned scale before. So I think what you're getting at is how do we get it to scale? And that takes resources and a commitment. And, we have 50 states in the District of Columbia just in this country who all operate their own education systems. Often it's done at the district level or the county level, not even the state level. So it's a huge management issue. Someone today talked about, I'm trying to remember which country it was, where it was Costa Rica, where they've integrated environmental education across every grade level, across every curriculum, and that's fantastic. We likely wouldn't see that in this country.
But I think part of what we're trying to do as well is create, people that think outwardly, look for creative solutions, and we need lots of creative solutions. How do we get around this fear of being afraid of the other? How do we, become a society where everybody's included? How do we make sure that everybody has enough to eat? There are all these huge questions. If you have an inequitable world, an inequitable country, then, the country as a whole isn't really a success in my eyes. If 1% of your population is super rich and 90% are struggling, you've got a real problem. There's something wrong with this system, and it will change eventually.
And I'm not sure that environmental education is the whole solution to those huge issues and challenges, but we certainly can have a piece of it.
I don't know. I think it might be a bigger piece. This opens up so many doors. We call it environmental education, and before we jumped on to this podcast, we were talking about language and whether it's nature education or conservation education or environmental education. But whatever we want to call it, it opens up so many doors, starting with the very first one is if you appreciate this thing and you're kind to this thing, that kindness has got to seep into other parts of your fiber and your perceptions of the world.
I believe that too. I'm not... I really believe that environmental education is the answer. I think it's good education. I think I have often said to educators, environmental education is just good education. And that's what we have to be promoting. And it's not just nature. It's not just science. It's not just social studies. It's not just civic education. It's all of the above. And that's what a good educator could and should do if given the right tools and support and resources. So yes, I think environmental education will change. That's why I've been in this my whole career, because I believe in it. I want to make this world a better place, and I see that environmental education it does have a huge role in it. But Gus is talking about a lot of serious big issues.
But they are all under that umbrella.
And we all live under those circumstances. The reality is there.
No, you're in Canada. You're not here in this country.
Well, even Canada is still impacted by all of this that's going on, especially what happens in the United States. I say in Canada, if the United States sneezes, we catch a cold.
Sorry.
I'm looking behind the two of you at the World We Want logo on the screen, and it's a round planet. And I've always said, the problem is we haven't figured out that if we look hard enough that way, we see our butts. We need a little more of that attitude that we can't escape any of this.
What did Mir say? You can't pick a flower without touching a star or something. I can't remember that exact quote, but there's
Einstein had a version of that, but he used the back of his head.
On a more valuable note, the NAAEE conference brings together hundreds, thousands of people involved in environmental education. And at this year's conference, we saw so many first-time attendees, a lot of whom were still in their 20s. What piece of wisdom would you both give them about this?
What about that journey do they need to understand to be successful, that they don't get burnt out, they don't feel it's hopeless, that they they see that what they are accomplishing is part of something bigger, and that it is worth all the sacrifice and effort.
Wow. While you were framing that question, and I was thinking about the start of my career and what I thought I knew then and what I learned over time. And it's been a remarkable journey. And I would just say that I think for young people that they ought to look at it as a journey of continuous improvement, that things won't be the same as when they started, and they're not going to be the same a year from now, 10 years from now, that they need to be resilient and adapt to change and accept the difficulties that they're going to face with joy, because it's part of the journey. I think it's a lot about personal relationships as well, that I think one of the things that's helped me is in all of my work, it's about the people. And it's not about me, and it's not about just the materials that I'm trying to share, but it's our relationship and what we have to share together and learn from and with each other. And not that there's top down and bottom up, but that we're all, in this wonderful world to help make it a better place.
To that, I would add, be humble. Learn from the people that you are working with and the audiences who you engage with. They have a lot to offer, yes, and they should be playing a role in developing and giving you direction on what they need. So listen to the people that you're working with, because they have a lot to offer you in terms of what could be a successful program.
Do you mean respect your elders?
Yes.
As we are the elders now.
But respect your youngers as well,
yes,
because children have a lot to
yes,
offer as well. So being open to suggestions and looking, don't be so fast about saying something's not going to work.
Right.
Explore whether, okay, that sounds really interesting. How will we do it? Let's work together to figure out if there's some way to do it. Maybe we can't do exactly what you said, but maybe we can do something that's similar. And that sort of recognizes the person, respects the person, empowers them because they've been listened to. So, yeah. And the other thing I would say is be kind to yourself.
Yes.
You're going to make mistakes. And there are lots of turns in the road, and you have to be clear about what's important to oneself, what makes you happy, and to follow that path. If it's working with children in an environment, if it's working with a faith community in a church group, that's another route. There are lots of different avenues to do this work, and you don't have to have the label of environmental educator to do the work. And I think the more people appreciate that, the better off we're all going to be, because you really have to get these messages from a large number of people. If you're only hearing that message from one person, it's going to go by the wayside. So we need a lot more educators out there that, and we can all be educators. And we can all be giving those messages about being kind and listening to each other, being civil, trying to figure out ways that we can get, work together. I think we've got a lot of work to do there, but I think certainly education plays a role in making that happen, and being comfortable with who you are.
I think about all these new educators who are just now stepping into the environmental education field, who come from such a huge diversity of backgrounds and identities. Many of them are not even 30 years old. And for them to know that there are all these connecting threads like yourselves, this community that's all rooted in the same goal, that's pretty amazing.
Yeah. It's a wonderful world.
I want to thank Kathy and Gus for their In the Trenches perspective on teacher training and tools to help educators of all types integrate environmental education into a more interdisciplinary approach. Find out more about these examples and resources that Kathy and Gus discussed by visiting our episode webpage at NAAEE.org NAAEE.org/podcast. That's NAAEE.org/podcast. The World We Want podcast is a production of NAAEE, the North American Association for Environmental Education. A special thanks to our entire team, Carrie Albright, Judy Browse, Jimena Cuenca, and Stacy Pierpoint. I'm your host, Gerry Ellis. Thanks for listening, and thanks for sharing The World We Want, the NAAEE podcast.